Well, good morning, everyone. It's great to be here and be able to worship the Lord with you all. We're at the part of our worship service where we're going to have a lesson from the Word of God. So I'd ask that you'd have your Bible out and be following along with me as we're going to be in our Bibles here this morning. We do have some that are visiting with us. Really glad that you've chosen to be here. I know sometimes it can be hard to come to a new place, but we hope that you'll be encouraged and be edified by what we're doing here this morning. It's the first Sunday of the month. Hard to believe it's already November. The year is quickly coming to an end, but the first Sunday of the month is typically when we try and cover a lesson from our annual theme, which is Tell Me the Story of Jesus. This has been a really fun theme this year. I've been excited to tell the best story there is, telling the story of Jesus. But this last quarter of the year, we're focusing on the resurrection. Last month, we kind of laid the foundation, talking about how important the resurrection is. We spent a lot of time, well, not actually that much time. I quickly went through almost every single instance in the book of Acts where the resurrection is mentioned. And this is the foundation of our belief. But this month, I want us to talk about more of the evidences of the resurrection. Is this really a rational thing that we believe? Is this something that we can be certain of, that Jesus actually was raised from the dead? It's important because our whole hope rests on this claim. And so I'm in 1 Corinthians chapter 15. Can you turn over there, please? It might be helpful if you have a little marker in your Bible to just place it there in 1 Corinthians 15. We're going to be coming back to this text throughout our lesson here this morning. But the resurrection, this is the claim of Christianity. This is what we believe. 1 Corinthians 15 and verse 14, it says, "And if Christ has not been raised, then our preaching is in vain, and your faith is in vain." Oh, we appreciate how honest Paul is. The Apostle Paul is brutally honest here about the truth of the Christian religion, that if Christ has not been raised, we are wasting our time. Everything hangs or falls on the resurrection of Jesus. And so what that means then is Christianity is largely that of a historical religion. A historical religion. You may say, well, what does that mean? Well, allow me to explain. Because oftentimes today, when people think about Christianity, they often think about Christianity in terms of moral terms, right? Doing right and doing wrong. And they boil Christianity down to like a moral checklist of this is the way that you should live, this is the way you should not live, right? The thou shalls and the thou shalt nots. But the the moral code of the Bible is really similar to a lot of other religions around the world. Especially that of monotheistic religions, those who profess belief in one God, right? This may not be groundbreaking, but maybe you've never considered this, right? Muslims believe that adultery is wrong. Orthodox Jews believe that drunkenness and stealing and divorce is wrong. And we could go down and down the list. And while I'm not suggesting that all religions, especially monotheistic religions, believe everything the same way and believe everything the same thing, no, there are so many similarities about the moral codes of a lot of religions. The morality, the ethics of what we believe. So what is it that separates Christianity from the rest of the world? What really makes us unique in what we believe? It's the resurrection. It's that our faith is rooted in confession, that we believe that Jesus is the Son of God and that He was raised from the dead. We believe that 2,000 years ago, Jesus was killed on Friday but raised by Sunday by the power of God. That the tomb was empty. And that by God raising Him up, that means that death no longer has any power over Jesus, proving and vindicating that Jesus was everything that He said and taught. And that's why we spent so much time last month looking in the book of Acts, that this is the foundation that the apostles go out and spread, the good news about Jesus, not just His death on the cross and what that means. That's a huge part of it, but also that He has been raised and that He's coming back. And so this morning, let's examine the historicity of the resurrection. And I'll use that word throughout the lesson. Historicity, just a fancy word of saying if something is historically accurate, historically authentic. Can we know that this is true? Because if we are truly a historical religion, then like I said, everything hangs and falls on this claim, this historical statement that God raised Jesus from the dead 2,000 years ago. That's what it all rests upon. And so can we be certain? Can we really be certain? Can we have the type of faith, the assurance that the Apostle Paul had there again in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, when he raises all these hypotheticals, the implications, if Christ has not been raised, he says in 1 Corinthians 15 and verse 20, but in fact Christ has been raised from the dead. He speaks about it matter-of-factly, that Christ has been raised. But it's not just the Apostle Paul. We read through the New Testament and we see that believers were willing, Christians were willing to die for this truth. That they were unwavering, that they would not forsake this confession. And so can we today, in the year 2024, can we be certain that Jesus was raised from the dead? Living in an age of skepticism, some of us might be inclined to say, well, no. Maybe you're here today and you're not sure what you believe, and you're thinking, well, is there any way that we can be certain about anything? I want to start by addressing the importance and the danger of our assumptions. Because we live in a culture that is bent towards scientific assumptions about how you prove something is true. And the fruit of that mindset may be in our lives more than we even realize. And because of that, if we're not careful, we can come to accept the scientific age's assumptions of what is true or not, and how you prove what is true or not. Because our assumptions matter. And rather than you take my word for it, let's do a little activity together. Read this with me. It says, it is a hot August afternoon. The location is the living room in an old Victorian mansion. The 7-foot window is open and the curtains are blowing in the breeze generated by the thunderstorm that just passed through the area. On the floor are the bodies of Bill and Mary. They are surrounded by puddles of water and broken glass. Neither Bill or Mary are wearing clothes. So upon reading that, what happened to Bill and Mary? Some of you at first blush, right? You may read that and say, well, maybe they're there because of a storm, right? Maybe it's a tornado that came through and that's why they are dead. Maybe some of you, like, your crime podcast, true crime series, and you're thinking, no, there's foul play involved. This is like a murder mystery. This is the beginning of a podcast. I've listened to something like this. But without me changing any of the details, changing any of the words, reorganizing it in any way, not even touching that paragraph at all, what if I told you that Bill and Mary are just fish? They're just goldfish, and the fishbowl got knocked over in the storm. See, do you see that? It's a simple activity. But I think we need to see how our assumptions impact our thinking, because assumptions are powerful in what we see. What we see may not change, right? I didn't change any of the words. I didn't change the order or anything like that. But what we perceive the meaning in what we see, what's true and what's false, can be greatly affected by the assumptions that we hold. And so today, our culture operates almost exclusively off of the scientific method, right? That the scientific model, the scientific method, this is how you determine certainty, if something happened or not, if something is reliable, if something is true. And the scientific model is based largely in that which is observable. But already, right there, almost immediately, there is a bias in what science can find as true or not. Because if something is observable, it must be material. The immaterial is taken off the table, which means the supernatural, the miraculous. And that would definitely include a claim like the resurrection. And so for many, the resurrection out of the gate, it never even gets a fair chance. And that's why some of the most common, and maybe even the most famous ways that critics try to deny the resurrection is they work in a way that removes the supernatural. Since there are no miracles, since that can't be a rational way that we think about how something is true, they come up with claims such as this. Some of you are familiar with these claims, right? Some critics will claim that deny the resurrection by saying that, well, here's a logical conclusion. The disciples just stole the body. That is what happened. And this is largely the most popular, the most common theory that is out there. But I would say that's for a reason. It's the original claim, right? But here's a big problem with this, and this is what was spread in New Testament times. The problem is Pilate had safeguards in place to prevent this very thing from happening. You'll remember, people came to him concerned like, hey, he claimed that he'll be raised from the dead. Let's seal the tomb. Let's put guards there. And Pilate says, let's make that happen. In Matthew 27 and verse 64, one of my favorite verses in the Bible, it says, therefore order the tomb to be made secure until the third day, lest his disciples go and steal him away and tell the people he has risen from the dead. And he says, and the last fraud will be worse than the first. And so they already considered this. They already thought that this may be something that could happen. And so safeguards were in place to prevent this very thing from happening. Or maybe one of my favorite theories that people have is they say, well, Jesus didn't actually die. He swooned, right? Swooned, fancy word for he passed out. He lost consciousness. I mean, let's think about that for a second. Just play along with me, right? Jesus, a man who was beat and scourged within an inch of his life, crucified on a cross by not your average Jew, but by Roman professional soldiers who had done many crucifixions before, stabbed him in the side. The historical account tells us that when they stabbed the side and the spear came out, what came out? Blood and water, showing that suffocation was the result of death. But no, he was not mortally wounded, just severely wounded, placed in a cold tomb, and then when the temperature dropped that night, he regained consciousness, awoke, was able to move a giant stone and sneak past. I'm not even going to suggest that he fought him, but he stuck past the guards, and that's what happened. And we say believing in the resurrection takes a lot of faith. That view takes as much faith to believe. And I want you to appreciate that with what this chart is showing and how I'm talking about the scientific method, especially with what is observable. This is huge in how it impacts us today. And you may think, this doesn't really have much impact on my day-to-day life. This doesn't really affect me. But in our day and time, there are so many distinctions being made today about who Jesus is. What I mean by that, biblical scholarship is pumping out so many books that you can't even keep up with it. Try and listen to all the podcasts. You can't do it. And what they're making a distinction of is the Jesus of history versus the Jesus of the Christian faith. Scholars and seekers alike are on a quest for what is called today the historical Jesus, who Jesus really is. And what they mean by that is strip away the legends, strip away the stories that got added over the past hundreds and thousands of years, and what are we left with who Jesus actually is? You guys want to look that up on your own time, I'll just mention this. You can write down the Jesus Seminar, one of the more famous quests that's out there, one of the famous activities where people try to determine what in the Gospels did Jesus actually do. But those scholars operate from the assumption, they're great scholars, better than any of us, I would argue. But they operate from the assumption that they don't believe in the supernatural. They don't believe in the miraculous. So it's no surprise when they go and they examine the Gospels, all 4 Gospel accounts, they lay out every word that Jesus said, every act that they did. And guess what? Barely 15% of the Gospels actually happened in their mind. That's the historical Jesus. A powerless, non-divine God, just a good teacher, good morals. That's who Jesus is being presented as in so many ways today. But it's not just that science operates that something must be observable for it to be true. Scientifically true means that it must also be repeatable, which means, let's use a good family here, the Parkers, right, from Australia. Let's say that would mean that if they did an experiment in Australia, if they replicated that and did it here in Utah, that the same result would occur, right? That would back the hypothesis of what it means for something to be repeatable. But when we talk about history and what is historically true, history cannot be repeated. History can't be duplicated in that way, which means history cannot be proven by scientific means. Because history is largely the story of unique individuals living unique lives that, by definition, only happened once. We can't just put George Washington and Abraham Lincoln in an incubator and redo it, right? That's not how it works. That's not how history works. And so if you're here this morning and you're looking for me to give you just a scientific validation or reasoning, that's not how history works. There's a difference in historical knowledge and knowing and how we arrive at that truth versus scientific knowing and knowledge. But again, in our culture of the assumption and the way that the scientific model works, it's presented as if this is the highest way of knowing, the only way of knowing what is actually true. But that is going to severely hinder the way that we view the past and discover what actually happened. Because, brethren, I want you to understand that there are plenty of things that cannot be proven by the scientific method, but actually happened in the past. See, by definition, history is not repeatable, but it is real. Don't believe me, right? You are here this morning because you are the product of history. You have a family history, right? even though that can't be repeated. The truth of the matter is, when we think about proving something, whether it happened historically or not, there's really two ways that we determine that. And this is agreed upon even in, yes, the scientific communities, that people will agree that largely, yes, you need one of two things. If you have both, even better. But you need one of two things. You need first material evidence, material artifacts. What would that look like? Things like tools, artwork, vessels, medals, if you have them, right, photographs, things of that nature, weapons and clothing. The second would be eyewitnesses. And what happens when we're talking about history that goes way back, right? 2,000 years. There's no eyewitnesses around. So what we have to go off of is, well, when eyewitnesses die, they write down what they saw. And those get passed down and those get passed down. We call those manuscripts today. But these are largely the two agreed upon standards for proving whether something happened in the past. Consider Abraham Lincoln, right? I mentioned him a second ago. We have both material evidence of his existence. We can go back in museums in the U.S., you can see the penknife that he always had with him, or his famous golden and black cane that he would use in his older age. We even have photographs, right? And we have ample eyewitness testimony. But go back way further. Let's go way back. A name like Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great. Did he exist? Was he a real person? I mean, in your history class, that's not going to get disputed. But we have no material evidence or artifacts from his life, from his personal belongings, that is. Now, we can look back in Alexander the Great's life, and we have a lot of eyewitness testimony, though. We have a lot of eyewitnesses that talk about how he conquered the ancient world, the known ancient world at that time. And not just that, we can see the implications. We can see the effect of Alexander the Great in his life. You can see the Greek influence on how that spread throughout the world, the spread of the Greek language, that it wasn't just in one place, it was all over the world. And that's why people don't go into history classes and push back on whether or not Alexander the Great lived or not. We accept that. We widely accept that yes, Alexander the Great, he lived. He was a real historical person. So with all that being said, why is it then when we talk about the Bible and the resurrection of Jesus, is there so much doubt? Is there so much pushback and a huge problem for people accepting the claims of Christianity? Accepting the claim that Jesus was died and raised from the dead? I think the problem is because of this. Nothing really changes in my life today if I don't believe Abraham Lincoln existed or Alexander the Great existed, other than I will fail history class, right? But if God raised Jesus from the dead, then that means everything in my life changes. The implications of that statement and that historical claim are life-changing, even 2,000 years later. And so today we look back and we see what is needed to determine what actually happened in the past. How can we find if something is historically accurate? And the Bible presents us with both of that. Outside the Bible, we're presented with facts of this truth. I'm going to talk a lot this morning for the rest of our time about eyewitness testimony, the certainty of the resurrection. Let's consider the eyewitness testimony. In 1 Corinthians chapter 15, we already read it once this morning, but it doesn't hurt to read this again. 1 Corinthians 15, look at what the Apostle Paul, what he appeals to here in verses 3 through 8. He says, "For I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received, that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day in accordance with the Scriptures, and then he appeared to Cephas, then to the 12. Then he appeared to more than 500 brothers at one time, most of whom are still alive, though some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles. Last of all, as to one untimely born, he appeared to me. For I am the least of the apostles, unworthy to be called an apostle, because I persecuted the church of God." So Paul, what does he do here? He lists a lot of people. A lot of eyewitnesses are mentioned here in this text. And so in a sense, Paul, what is he doing? He's inviting fact-checking. If you want to know the validity, you want to know the truth of what I'm saying, go talk to these people. And he even lets us know, most of whom are still alive. They're around. They're living today. Go talk with them. Go talk with people like Cephas, which we know, who is that? That's Peter. Or he mentions there in verse 7, James. And not James the apostle. He would be dead by this time. This is James, the brother of Jesus. we read through the Gospels and was very reluctant to believe some of the claims of Jesus, but now he's here mentioned as a witness. Let me give you a little bit of a timeline here. 1 Corinthians is written in the early 50s. The early 50s. So that means we are operating no more than 25, maybe about 20 years after the resurrection of Jesus. And that's important because that lets us know that this is a living memory to the people this is being written to. A living memory. It's almost the same distance from us to 9/11, right? And do you remember 9/11? Some of you who are younger are like, no, I don't. Heard stories, right? But those of you who are older, you think back, you remember what happened on 9/11. It's a famous question, right? People ask that all the time. Where were you on the morning of 9/11? And you can recall the events of that day. You remember seeing the footage. You know what that day was like. And so if someone started to change the narrative, started to change what actually happened on that day drastically, you know what would happen? People would say, no, that's not how that happened. That's not what happened at all. And so when Paul name checks these people as witnesses who can vouch for the historicity of the resurrection, it's letting us know that, hey, if you want to know if this is true or not, go back and talk with them. Do some homework. Go and talk with them. Go see if this is true. But maybe the most impressive thing that he appeals to here in 1 Corinthians 15 is that Jesus appeared to over 500 people at one time. 500 people. I'll tell you this. If 500 people can tell the same story, that lets us know that something happened. Right? Any other event in human history where 500 people are witnesses to it and the story lines up, the story matches, there's no debate. There's no doubt about whether or not this thing occurred. And to this day, this is even how we verify the truth and what happened in the past. And 500 is significant because some of the critics will claim that, well, hey, the eyewitnesses of the resurrection, Jesus didn't actually raise, it was just a hallucination. They saw this. And so if you have a handout on the right side, I list some of the common theories that people will say why the resurrection happened. Hallucination is out there, but it's not a very popular one because, well, thanks to modern science, it shows us that hallucinations are never shared, right? It's not that like a whole group of people have the same hallucination. That's not how it works. They're individualistic in their nature. And so eyewitnesses, we understand this today. This is how we prove what happened in the past. And even here in Utah, this will be the case and what will happen, yes, tomorrow. Because every day someone will sit in a courtroom and they will stand trial and they will plead their innocence. And then the prosecutor will have witnesses take the stand and people will be able to say, hey, I saw him with my own eyes. This is what he did. This is what happened. And guess what? If just 5 or 10 eyewitnesses say that they saw someone do that, this is what happens. Because what's going to persuade 8 jurors, if it's a felony, of what really happened? 10 people saying, I saw this happen, this is what occurred, or one person saying, no, I didn't do it, I'm innocent. See, this is how we still determine what is true in the past, even in our day and time, even, yes, in the year 2024. A trial is where we dispute about what happened in the past to determine the truth. And so the significance of this, every day in our country, people are sometimes sentenced to life in prison for the rest of their life on the basis of what? On the basis of eyewitness testimony. And so we recognize the validity of eyewitness testimony when those stories line up, when those stories match, of determining what happened in the past. And so when Paul in 1 Corinthians 15 appeals to 500 witnesses among the other names mentioned, it's an invitation to go check it out. Go search it out for yourself to see if this is what happened. Because if Paul is embellishing or changing the story, 500 people at a minimum won't let that story be passed down. And let's understand this as well, that people in first century times were not dummies. We get so caught up in where we are on the timeline, we call it chronological snobbery, right? We think because we're so educated in 2024 that we're just so advanced from previous civilizations. But you know what? Even people back then understood that when someone dies, they don't come back alive. They were not dummies. And so let's not get caught up in the supposed intellect of our age, and we need to get over ourselves. They built the pyramids, they built aqueducts, they built roads that still stand today. They weren't stupid. And so they know the way that things normally work. And that's even why Paul appeals to Festus. Festus makes that claim, like, all your learning has driven you mad. You're out of your mind, Paul. What does he say to Festus? No, I am not out of my mind, most excellent Festus, but I am speaking true and rational words. For the king knows about these things, and to him I speak boldly. For I am persuaded that none of these things have escaped his notice, for this has not been done in a corner. When we think about the cross and what took place, not just with the crucifixion of Jesus, but also his resurrection, it didn't happen in a vacuum. It didn't happen in a small place in the world, and the story didn't spread, and very few people knew about it. It was a public spectacle, and it was not done in a corner. And so I will save a discussion on the proof of the material evidence for another day. I don't want to keep you here till Tuesday if I started that. That would be a while. But some extra biblical sources, I think you would enjoy studying that on your own if you like that. Think about some names like Josephus, Tacitus, Pliny the Younger, Suetonius, Justin Martyr, and his famous conversation with Trypho. Go to chapter 108. It talks about everything I've mentioned this morning. And there's so many more. Evidence exists beyond just eyewitness testimony that we can be certain of the resurrection of Jesus. And so I'm not going to spend much time on this at all, but just kind of in a way as we wrap up and summarizing what we've talked about. Why should you believe? Why can you have faith in the resurrection of Jesus, even though that's something that you weren't an eyewitness to and no one in your life has ever seen firsthand? Well, first, because of eyewitness testimony, because eyewitnesses saw the resurrected Lord. This is the primary evidence and reason that we've been talking about today, and we just can't write it off. We can't just overlook the fact that over 500 people saw the resurrected Lord. And some of the claims that people make today as well, hey, all the people that Jesus appeared to would have been biased, and that's why they would have promoted this lie that was spread. But let's be honest, too many people saw the resurrected Lord. And that's the reason why the truth was spread throughout the world and could not be stopped, as hard as the opposition tried. But not only did eyewitnesses see the resurrected Lord, we think about the disciples and their life, right? That they would end up dying for the cause of Christ. These same disciples who fled Jesus aside when he was betrayed and arrested and couldn't even be near the foot of the cross, just a few weeks later, what happened? They boldly go out and proclaim the gospel, professing belief, not just that he died, but that he was raised from the dead. And so we have to step back and say, what changed in their life? A drastic change. Men that were cowards, right? Peter didn't even want to be associated with Jesus, and yet boldly goes out and preaches just 7 weeks later. So what happened? What changed in their life? See, it seems to be so much more than blind faith or just a made-up faith. But understand this. So let's acknowledge what some people will say. Many people in history have died for a lie. Many people have died in history for a lie, for something that was not true. But few people, if any people, die for something that they know to be a lie. And that's a distinction I want you to think about. Because a question we have to ask ourselves is, what did the apostles gain by spreading this lie and being willing to die for it? If I'm espousing a belief that the Nebraska Cornhuskers are the greatest college football team that ever existed, and people said, you need to stop spreading that lie, which it is. It's saying, like, you need to stop spreading that lie or we will take your life away from you. You know what I'm going to do? I'm quickly going to find another message to preach, right? I'm going to switch pretty fast. And so I have to be absolutely convinced, absolutely convicted that this is true if I'm not only going to teach this publicly, but be willing to die for this belief. And that's why Peter says in 2 Peter 1 and verse 16, very important passage, letting us know that these are true and rational words, when he says, for we do not follow cleverly devised myths when we made known to you the power and coming of our Lord Jesus Christ, but we were eyewitnesses of his majesty. I don't think the eyewitnesses there is limited just to the resurrection. I think that would include in context the transfiguration, that they saw Jesus for who he is. And they're not making this up. And lastly, we consider that skeptics were even turned into believers. That some people that were so vehemently opposed to Jesus would be willing to examine the evidence, or in some instances have it confronted them, right? Have to face that truth, and their lives completely change. Or you think about maybe less radical versions of that, right? Thomas and his famous interaction with Jesus. that he would not believe until he saw the Lord, and then he's invited to place his hands on the hands of Jesus. Or James, right, the brother of Jesus, we mentioned him earlier in 1 Corinthians 15, that he was someone who thought Jesus was out of his mind, and yet later in his life doesn't even appeal to Jesus as his brother, but calls him his Lord and Master. But maybe the most famous is the Apostle Paul, right? The Apostle Paul, on that road to Damascus, he didn't just see a bright light shining down. I hope that's not our takeaway when we teach little kids. He saw a bright light, yes, that's a huge part of it. But as he retells in Acts chapter 26, he saw Jesus. He saw the resurrected Lord. He was an eyewitness of that event. And in chapter 26, Paul makes it clear when he's making his defense before Festus that he was someone who fought violently against Christians. He was not a fan of Jesus. He was not for Jesus. He thought Jesus was a fake. He did not believe that he was the Messiah. And that is why he spent his life imprisoning Christians and trying to stop the way of Jesus. And yet his life maybe serves as the most powerful eyewitness who testifies the truth of Jesus and his resurrection. And so as we contemplate all that we've talked about this morning, I know that's a lot of information, but I hope it gives you a lot to think and contemplate in your life. I want you to understand that the problem with the resurrection has never been a lack of evidence. It's never been a lack of eyewitness testimony. The problem has always been with the implications of that evidence. See, upon the realization that and confession that Jesus is Lord, that he was raised from the dead, that means that everything in my life has to change. And some of you have experienced that too, right? Maybe you grew up unchurched, never stepped foot in any type of church building, never opened the Bible, and then all of a sudden when someone taught you the gospel and you've read it and you've realized the truth of what you're reading, that's an overwhelming moment, isn't it? The sensation, the crushing weight that everything in my life from this moment on has to change. And it's rooted in what? It's rooted in the claim that Jesus died on the cross and was raised from the dead. The gospel in 1 Corinthians 15, verses 3 and 4. And so we understand today that the implications of Jesus' resurrection are life-changing. But what I mean by that is the resurrection of Jesus is not just a truth to live by, but it's a pattern for a new life. A new life that we live in Romans chapter 6, that we may be raised in the waters of baptism to walk in what? To walk in newness of life. Patterned after the resurrection of Jesus himself. And so if you're here this morning and you're ready to give your life to Jesus, to die to self, be buried with him in the waters of baptism, and raised to walk in newness of life, we invite you to come to the front as we stand and sing the song, Selected.